in these workshops, I would give a note. I would say, got to stop with the dates. But somebody in the group saw it when they were telling the story with too many dates. If suddenly it became an example of what not to do in a way. And so when they corrected it and did it better, they saw how the story improved by taking that note. So they were learning from each other. So it wasn't just me telling them, it was each other showing each other what worked and what made a better story. And you can really take all of those tools and then apply them later into whatever aspect it is, whether it's sales or whether it's marketing or whether it's, just interacting with your colleagues.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Elisabeth Swan.
And I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and we're from the Just in Time Cafe. Welcome to our podcast. At the cafe, we wrestle with tough questions, talk to groundbreakers, discuss great books. One of them is going to be today. Get insights from Lean Six Sigma leaders and practitioners who are making a difference in the world.
We let you in on helpful apps, we bring you the news, and we challenge the status quo so you can build your problem-solving muscles.
So, Elisabeth, what is on the cafe menu?
Well, Tracy, today at the cafe we are sitting down with Meg Bowles, co-author of the New York Times bestseller, How to Tell a Story, to explore why stories power so much of our work and our lives. In Book Buzz, we'll go back to this book and we'll spill what we underlined and dog-eared and rolled all over the book. We have the stakes, the structure of stories, the callbacks, and more. And then for Q&A, we'll tackle that evergreen trap, jumping to solutions before we've even named a problem. No scripts, no cue cards today, Tracy. No safety net. Let's go.
Up next, it's Book Buzz.
I read this book while I was on vacation, and I ripped right through it, and I wrote all over the margins. And as I mentioned, the week I got back, the main author, our guest, Meg Bowles, was at a friend's house for dinner. And she was there. She was visiting from Sweden. She wasn't just visiting. She was there to work, right? She was there because she was working with Vicki Merrick, a local radio producer, on a 2-day workshop. They were shepherding a group of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, right? There's a lot of big science organizations down here. That's one of the big ones. To bring their stories to stage, and how often do you get to read a kind of transformative book and then meet the author?
I mean, was that completely serendipitous?
It was totally serendipitous. I mean, I did not know she was staying in Vic's cottage while they were running this workshop. I didn't even know the ins and outs of how the workshop was happening. I know. And then I got to go to the event. So anyway, that was my first experience with the book. What struck you most about the book?
Well, I'm really glad you read this book because I haven't quite finished it. I'm almost there, but it was a great book in terms of like getting ready to tell your stories. I really like the chapter on mining for stories with memories because honestly, when you think about it, you're like stories. Do people? I mean, I don't think I've ever said I've got some great stories. I mean, I've never, and you think, okay, well, I don't really know if my stories are worthwhile. Sometimes they are. And so just thinking through that chapter and mining for stories, it got my creative juices really flowing about all kinds of stories that I probably have. And I didn't think I had very many. So things like think about out of the ordinary encounters or a time when you broke a pattern or a habit and something shifted for you. And I was like, oh, that happens a lot. Or a moment that interrupts a normal routine of some kind. So these are all, of course, I didn't know the name of them. These are all inciting incidents, right? Mm-hmm. The thing that actually kicks off your story. And it could be a changing belief or something that happened that made you stronger or a time when you were just plain wrong. So these were like, oh yeah, of course, all these things. And then of course, decisions, like that's a whole section of, mining for memories when you had to make a decision about something, whether it was at work or with a friend or a romantic partner or at home. And so I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much opportunity that can be shared through stories. It actually made me feel like, wow, I really better learn how to tell better stories.
You better, Tracy. I think you discount how many stories you have. You use them all the time to teach. You've used them on this podcast. I mean, yeah, I can tell the moments when the inciting incidents, as it were, that happened to you. Like, you had one last month, I think, about, coaching your kids, right? And when you realized the whole, telling was over, you had to actually deal with them in a different way, right? So
Uh-huh.
that's a story you tell, and it's really, for my purposes, really helpful in terms of talking to people about being a leader who leads with inquiry and, changing your style.
Hmm.
So for me, a technique that stood out from the book was the one sentence rule. What's the one sentence that captures your story if you had to boil it down? And it reminded me of a technique we've used, which is, turn your problem statement to a 3-worder, right? Claims are late, medications are missing, right? You boil it down because people can get like incredibly verbose about what the problem is. And that, after a paragraph, you're like, what are we talking about? So,
Uh-huh.
so the
Uh-huh.
3-worder is the same thing in stories. Like, what are we talking about? And I just had this crazy, kind of 29-year later meetup. Well, I've met him in the meantime at different things, but I worked with my colleague, Thomas Bertels, and we were running a simulation earlier this week. And we had run one the first time we ever worked together 29 years ago. It was a different simulation. It was a different client, all that, but 29 years ago in Leipzig, Germany. And it was a comedy of errors, including the entire simulation getting stuck in customs, like all our materials. Yeah, everything could have gone wrong went wrong. All the marketing materials came through. He reminded me of that. Like, oh, they got those through. Yeah, but none of the materials we actually had to work. So that's probably striking terror in your heart, like showing up at a client, not having the stuff, because simulations, you really need the stuff to make it work.
Yeah.
And so I was
Hmm.
like, we were both talking about, we want to write that story for ourselves, right? And we were just commenting all the players involved. And these are big characters. One of them, after, he was the head of this $1 billion organization that just sold to GE. And he got named as kind of the Alan Greenspan of the German government, shortly after this simulation. So that's who, kiboshed our simulation. Anyway, I was like contemplating what's the one sentence, for
Uh-huh.
this. Because, we talk about failure, learning from your mistakes. But to me, I look at that and I say how failure forged a friendship.
Ooh.
Thomas and I, he would just leave me emails, voicemails, just like 3 words about, what a colossal cock up it was. And then that bonded us. We were, bonded, and we sort of had different iterations, different companies that we've formed ourselves or work with other people. But anyway, we are still buds so many years later. So, what did you think of things like the fewer details rule?
Yes, I think that was really helpful because I do feel like sometimes people you kind of lose the plot. So you're trying to follow along with the story, and then all of a sudden you feel like you start having to write something down because there's so many dates in there, or there's numbers, or there's too many extra names, and it actually takes away from the story because I really visualize the story when people are telling me a story. Like I actually can see it in my head happening,
Mm,
and and those numbers don't do it for me, or those what they call, I guess, too many vases on the mantle problem. You clear off the clutter so the important details pop, or that the visualization of the story happens more. So, dates, numbers, extra names maybe aren't as important as what you're feeling, what you're hearing, what you're
mm.
smelling, even. So, how do we remove those extra things from the story and be mindful that we don't relay all the facts too much?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's huge.
What
Uh,
else did you take away from the book, Elisabeth?
yeah, yeah, no, I like your description of that you visualize things. And so a lot of that clutter would get in the way of the vision.
Yes.
That's a nice way to take it.
And
Uh,
actually you and I, we've exchanged feedback on stories and things that, you say, hey, take a look at this. And I love the way you write because, you create that. You create that vision. You create that story. Like when you talked about having friends in the canoe, and I was right there. And I remember, like, I just remember the vision of it as the story. And so my feedback is always, oh, the vision went away here.
Mm,
Why is that? Like
mm,
it's starting to fade a little bit. Like something happened in the story where I'm not, it's fading now.
yeah.
So like stuff like that, I think is
Yeah. And
really,
clutter can get in the way of that. I think that's a
yeah.
great way of looking at it. And you are good at that. I was also really struck uh, about the difference between a story and an anecdote. And when I say struck, it was actually a moment of going, "Oh God, all I tell are anecdotes." Like, oh my God, they are amusing and yet lack depth. That was the description. I was like, is that me? Am I amusing but lack depth? I was like, so anyway, but what I love was that they also were like, but don't just throw those out. How do you turn your favorite anecdote into a story? And one of the things they call out is, what are the stakes, right? There have to be stakes in a story. And that is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. What are the stakes, right? When I think about me and Thomas in Germany, right? That was like the beginning of our big gig with GE, man. That whole thing could have disappeared in a second. Well, for
Uh-huh.
us, not for
Uh-huh.
the consulting company. But so what are the stakes? And I tell a story in my keynote, the Praise Paradox keynote, to talk about our negativity bias. And after reading this book, I realized that I shortchanged the stakes, right? I'm in my late 20s. I'm lucky enough to work with this, quality icon that I revere, John Gaspari. We're working on an industrial video about the concept of value. And he had like 6 bestsellers out there on quality, customers, and time and value. And he was the VP at this consulting firm. I was clearly very junior. And this was, I came to work in the middle of this project, and he had left a Post-it note on my desk and it said, "See me." And I cannot tell you the terror. And I was thinking about, what was the terror? And it was this feeling that I had just completely ruined the situation. I had done something that he was going to just, cancel me being on the project, right? It was him trying to, this isn't working out, whatever it was. But I told myself this terrible story, and the stakes were incredibly high. I was so, yeah. Um, anyway, it really shifted the way I told the story. And I just did this at a keynote last week. And after I told that story, someone in the audience pulled me aside and said, "I write those notes. I write see me. I have to
Oh
find
my
a way
God.
I know." And I was like, oh, it was immediate feedback for me. It was like, oh, I gave the stakes, and to really get across how horrible it felt. And this person felt terrible. He was like, oh my God, I got to find another way to do that. But um, anyway, big shift. Any last thoughts, Tracy?
No, I would just say this is a great read. I can't, I'm very excited to finish it. I think it doesn't feel academic at all. And it's super helpful. It just is super helpful to increase your impact really on sharing stories, telling stories. And we need stories for all kinds. Like I think what was interesting with you, Elisabeth, is I think sometimes people think, oh, storytelling, that's like optional. Yeah, I mean, you need to learn Excel, but storytelling is nice to know. It's nice to have. But in reality, I mean, stories they weave into everything, right? So like what you told me when they had the course that she was there for, Meg in Woods Hole. It's these engineers are trying to tell stories so they can talk about what their products do better, right? Or that they can get more funding for what their mission. So you got to tell a good story, right? You got to tell a good story if you want your dad to buy you a car. You got to tell a good story if you want to raise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like it's not just storytelling like campfire stuff when I have time. Yeah, I'm going to put that as a deprioritization. Yeah, no, you shouldn't do that.
No. Well, both of us, I think, huge advocates of this book for everybody, right?
Absolutely. Thumbs up. Thumbs up.
I'm Elizabeth Swan, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe podcast. In a short while, you get to hear our interview with Meg Bowles, co-host of the Peabody Award-winning Moth Radio Hour.
Up next, it's Q&A.
Today's question is, how do you handle the impulse to jump to solution? And really, I'm asking, how do you handle that impulse in others? I suppose it's also in ourselves, but God knows at this late stage in our careers, hopefully we've gotten a handle on that. But I will say there's moments. But this issue feels like a never-ending deja vu loop, right? Where the people that we mentor and we coach, just constantly are going down this road. It's just knee-jerk. And I understand a lot of the reasons. We've often been trained, don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution. It feels productive. All the reasons. But I feel like I'm putting a LinkedIn query out to see how others deal with this. But I'm constantly torn on how to respond when people do this. And they do it in two stages of kind of classic problem solving. They insert it into the problem statement, right? The problem is the lack of automation, right? That's a classic problem that we hear. Or they sneak it into a gap analysis, like the root cause is a lack of a monitoring system, right? Those are very classic. And this is generally after I have given my spiel about how lack of indicates a solution masquerading as a problem, and help them practice sometimes, like extracting lack of and things like that. And one simple thing I do is just to honor their ideas for countermeasures by asking them to put them into a solution parking lot or put them into the countermeasures proposed segment of an A3. And that feels like a positive. So what about you, Tracy? What do you do?
Well, I don't know what it is about this particular thing, but I've had to take a step back. And so I've been engaged in 3 different clients, and this came up, no, 4 different clients in the last 2 weeks, and this came up every time. And that is, so again, kind of what you said, we are so used to jumping to solution that it's just natural. We're rewarded to have solutions. We're told we need to have solutions. And so people just jump to solutions all the time. And I sort of have to back up, and I tell people, if you're starting with a solution, then you're using project management techniques. You have a solution, you need a project manager, and you need that project manager to execute the solution. That's really what project management is. Yeah. And you don't, there's no root cause analysis. This has been decided. This is going to get implemented. Now go manage it, right? That is project management. And that starts with a solution. This methodology starts with a problem. It starts with a process problem. So I have to even back up out of the project, and I have to say, okay, think about when you pick a solution right at the get-go, you're choosing the approach of project management. But is that really the approach? And do you really know that that solution is going to solve the problem and the root cause? Because if you don't, you need to back into, okay, what are we trying to solve? What problem are we trying to solve? And how do we know this is going to solve it? And most of the time they say, well, we don't know. Okay, let's back up. Okay, now we're in process improvement. So I have to back into it all the time, but I have to get them to recognize that because they're choosing a solution, they're opting for not even applying this method at all. And recognizing that when you've got a problem, is it really project management as the approach, or is it really going to be process improvement? And we got to get them earlier. We can't just, you know what I mean? So I've been starting to talk about that and so this became a really interesting topic with one of my clients, because they're like, oh my God, we have so many solutions we're implementing. We're overwhelmed with projects. We're overwhelmed with project management projects, things we're implementing, and half of them, we don't even know if they're going to solve the problem. So we're just wasting people's time, wasting people's energy because they took the wrong approach automatically. So they love, like when I say that, they go, oh, like it's not just this particular thing that we're thinking about that is a problem. It's the overarching way we're just choosing projects in the project management vein.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so that's really where I've been spending a lot of my time talking about like that whole piece. Like there's lots of kinds of problems in organizations and there's lots of different approaches. You got to figure out which approach is best for that thing you're trying to solve. And we don't do that. We just go right to project management.
Yeah. I love that. And I have tried to bring that up as I get these problem statements that are clearly solutions. And I'll say, and I'll even ask legit, like, if that really is, if you know all the reasons this is happening and this is absolutely the solution and you've got it all signed off, then, we're dealing with implementation. This isn't, but I think that's a great, just raise them up a little bit, raise them up and ask those questions.
Mhm.
The other place I see it is in the root causes, right? And so that one, I think a redirect is often, what would that solution solve, right? If I recognize, if you say lack of automation, you're saying automation is going to solve it. So what is automation solving here? So I focus on inquiry to get them to articulate what's the actual thing they're solving for. And I swear some of them just look at me cross-eyed. Like, what's she talking about? The issue is that it's not automated. Like, that's the issue. Yeah. So yeah, automation could definitely help. It helps in lots of ways, but it could be a costly shortcut, right? I worked with this woman. She was trying to stop all the rework that was happening with these rental agreements on medical equipment. And she knew that the change she'd asked for, IT systems had a backlog, which they usually do. And they couldn't make her change in time. So I said, well, what else can you do? Can you make some changes yourself in the meantime? Because she had a stack of these rental agreements. And I said, do you know where they generally go wrong? She goes, oh yeah, it's always in the credit card information. I was like, okay, well, what happened? She goes, well, they just do the front page and they don't look at the back page. I'm like, oh, so maybe we could rearrange that agreement so that that's up front and maybe you can highlight it, right? Because she said they skip information on the credit card piece. And I was like, all right, would visual management help where you, highlighted it? And she said, yeah, I think so. So she did that. She knew from what she had to constantly do rework on and it helped her redefine what she was asking information systems to change in terms of automation. Like she removed whole segments, she moved the credit card information, she made different parts clear. She fixed the process before she asked someone to automate it, basically.
Mhm.
I don't know. How do
Yeah.
you handle that throwing solutions at you at root cause?
Yeah. So this is interesting because it takes longer to explain this too, right? So it's more time and I'm okay with that, right? Because people are learning, but they just like pretty much figured out like the difference between a root cause and a problem and a solution. And so they're still messing with that. And then when if I say, lack of training is not a root cause, they're like, huh? Well, yeah, it is. No. Lack of training is masquerading as a solution because you're just saying lack of solution, lack of put this in place. So when you have that, it's not, but it sounds like, I feel like sometimes people think I'm just being really picky, but so I have to say, no, put the real root cause. And I go, why do you feel like they need training? And they look at me and they go, because they need training.
Yeah. But again, cross-eyed. What's
No,
wrong?
what's the real, like, why do they need training? Because there's a knowledge gap. Yes, that is the root cause. The root cause is a knowledge gap. Now, why can't you put training? Because that's a solution. And there's lots of ways to fulfill a knowledge gap. There's lots of options to fulfill a knowledge gap. It might be a job aid. It might be a visual aid. It might be some sort of visual management that you put together so that they understand the knowledge right at the point of use. But if you put training, that's the only thing you're going to implement, right?
That's it.
So you have to still explore what the knowledge gap is and where does it occur and why does it occur and when does it occur?
Yeah.
And then you can implement something to solve it. But if you just put training, you're just going to implement training.
Yeah.
And so, I feel like that takes a little longer and they still think, but training's important. That's not the point. The
Sure.
point is, this is not a root cause. So anyway, and then I have to go, does training help? Yes, it does help. Training always helps, but it's not a root cause. Lack of training is not a root cause. It's a solution. So anyway, I feel like I'm banging myself against the head, my head against the wall sometimes. But when they get it, I'm happy,
Yeah.
But
I
anyway.
got I got two. Actually, you reminded me of another one. I got two things I say when I hit these classic root cause solutions at root cause. So when they get to, lack of training, uh, a great question for people is, did you need to be trained to use a drive-through? Right? No. Okay.
No.
So somehow they built this really interesting process and no need to be trained on it. Could you do that? Like that's the ideal. You don't need training because as you're pointing out, there's visual guides, there's a route to
So
follow.
easy. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one I say is root cause. Like I always ask them, is the lack of a fire extinguisher, did the lack of a fire extinguisher cause the fire? They're like, no. Right. So just be mindful when you say lack of, you're talking about the fire extinguisher and that didn't cause the fire. So that one, that one sometimes lands. Then I get less cross-eyed and then maybe more like, oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But this conversation isn't over, is it, Tracy?
No, it is not. But I will say, I'll just share one other story about this, and this is funny. So I had somebody come to me maybe a year after I'd been helping them, and he goes, "I remember the first time I met you, and you told me um, that the root cause was not lack of automation." And I remember thinking in my head, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She has what? Of course it's automation. And then she goes, well, he goes, now, a year later, I finally understand what you meant. And I love that. I wanted to hug him, like, well, thank you. And then I go, what did you learn? Like, tell me. Right. And so, he kind of talked about, yeah, you can't just automate stuff. You might just automate a bad process. And that means the process. And so he like said all the right things. And I was like, good student, good student.
A plus.
A plus. I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe podcast. We host these monthly, so you can go to www.jitcafe.com and go to our podcast page.
Coming up next, it's an interview with our featured guest, Meg Bowles. Tracy, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about Meg?
Oh, I would absolutely love to. So I'm so happy we got her to be on this podcast. Maybe it was that dinner with a friend that she finally said, okay, to you, Elisabeth. But Meg Bowles is a founding member of the world-renowned storytelling organization, The Moth, and co-host of the Peabody Award-winning The Moth Radio Hour, which airs on 550 public radio stations in the United States. Over the decades, she's helped a wide array of storytellers craft their stories and has directed shows everywhere from Anchorage to London. Her background in television, Saturday Night Live, Comedy Central, Discovery, and film, Miramax, has sharpened her editorial sense and eye for detail. Bowles is an author of the New York Times best-selling book, How to Tell a Story, and you should read it. She is the artistic director of thecommonstage.org and executive director of multiplestories.se. And we are honored to have Meg at the cafe. Welcome to the cafe, Meg. We are so happy to have you.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, all the way from Sweden. Yeah, huge welcome, Meg. And I still sort of, it strikes me as so wild that only 1 week after I read How to Tell a Story, that I bump into you at a dinner during a mutual friend's house. And, as we stated, and you're the lightness in your room would testify, you are over in the EU. So we'll get into why you happen to be on Cape Cod as part of this interview. But yeah, huge welcome, Meg, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So first off, and I sometimes forget this kind of the origin questions, but what sparked your interest in, love of, storytelling? How did that kind of shift into a career?
Um, it was, I met George Dawes Green, who was the founder of The Moth. Met him randomly through friends, and he invited me to this new storytelling show that he was doing. He had done one in his apartment and had moved it into a bar in the Lower East Side, Manhattan. And I went and I was mesmerized. I was kind of amazed. People, just random people were getting up and telling stories. Some well known, some not so well known, and I was hooked. And so I started helping George actually find people to tell stories. I would go and I would write to people and, say, do you have a story? Try to get, in the beginning, everybody was like, what is it, like Hansel and Gretel? And I'm like, no, 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 a story from your life. Like, you don't have to tell a story. You have to tell your story or a story from your life. Um, and the Moth eventually got me a fax machine, which lived at the foot of my the foot of my bed in my studio apartment, and I would like fax astronauts, and I would fax, random people. I mean, obviously, we're talking many, many, many moons ago. Um, but I just was so enamored by, there was an intimacy. There was, just to hear people telling stories and having emotions and being able to relate to them, even though their lives were so different than mine, like a George Plimpton or a Frank McCourt or somebody like that would tell a story, and yet I had so much in common, just on this base level of being human. I mean, for lack of a better,
Hmm.
I know it's a simplistic way to say it, but I don't know, I was just hooked. And yeah, so, and ever since then, in school I studied documentary film, and I was always interested in other people's stories, but it was, I don't know, The Moth and working with people one on one to tell their stories that really hooked me.
Hmm. Hmm. No, I love that. And it's not, it is simple, but it really is a universal connection, us as humans. And sometimes I feel like we need reminders of that. Like we are all human and people aren't much different from each other. And we have different stages of life and different things that we do. And so these stories do help that connection. And which I think is why the draw is so mesmerizing. So Meg, you've had an incredible career already, from Saturday Night Live to The Moth to best-selling books. So what were some of the learnings about the power of stories that you've had at some of these stages? Like, what do you think? I don't know, what phase do you feel like was like so impactful? And I'm sure that maybe you haven't even reached that journey yet. Maybe you're gonna have the most impact coming up, and we don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's definitely, in the beginning, it was fun, right? It was entertainment. It was getting somebody to tell a fantastic story about some experience they'd had or adventure they'd been on. And over time, it definitely did evolve. Like, I remember I worked with, there were two stories that really jump into my mind when you asked that question. One was a gentleman named Damien Eccles, who had been on death row for a crime he hadn't committed. And I worked with him like like less than a month or so after he was released. There was a big, he got out of prison and he came to New York, and I worked with him to tell his story, and he was having such, I mean, post-traumatic stress clearly was, he was kind of going through that. And I worked with him, and he wanted to work with me every single day
Mm.
leading up to the show, which was unusual because I'll work with somebody, I'll run a story with them, and then maybe 3 days later we'll run it again. We'll run it until they feel comfortable. But he wanted to tell it every day. He wanted to work on it every day. And then when he finally, the day after he told it on stage, he called me and he said, I just want to thank you for walking me through this process. I feel like I left a little piece of the trauma on that stage last night. And I was just like, oh, wow. Like, it hit me that for him, this was like a really healing experience of being able to stand in front of a room and have people listen and hear
Mm,
him and acknowledge him.
mm,
And it just, I mean, it gives me chills now thinking about, but,
yeah.
and I had a similar thing with a gentleman who had worked at Fukushima when the earthquake happened in Japan. And he has a really harrowing story of the events of being, he was working in reactor one when the earthquake happened, and really feeling like this was the end of the earth. And then goes running away from the facility up a mountain, up a hill, to because he can see the tsunami is going to happen, right? And then it starts to rain ash, and he's like, "What the?" You know, I mean, it is such a harrowing story. But his was the same thing. You know, he was so traumatized. He was in depression. He hadn't celebrated Christmas. He had just kind of stopped living. He was just a little bit paralyzed. And
Mhm.
he too said to me afterwards, you know, he wrote to me and he said, "I just want you to know that we're pulling out the Christmas tree and we're like doing like," there was something about the power of telling his story that made him have control over it. You know, before it had been this thing that was traumatizing him, and it was chaotic in his brain. And then when he put shape to it and when he really thought about it and the emotion around it and was able to kind of articulate it and tell it to 1,000 people and be heard and felt and empathized with, like there was some kind of magic in that, because suddenly he had control of the narrative rather than narrative controlling him. And so that was really powerful. I think that they were in similar years around the same time period, and I started to realize, oh, there's a little bit more to this whole, the importance, the value of not just telling your story, but being heard and having people be able to hear and support you
Mhm.
and listen. Was really, that was a big eye opener for me, and I've noticed it over and over and over again, you know, in so many different ways.
Mm.
So
You know,
Wow.
that's fascinating because I think, well, at least in my mind, I focus so much on the impact a story has on another, it's skipping past the impact of telling a story has on the teller.
Mhm.
And what you describe as a transformation, so that honing and working through something, there's something shifting in the human doing the telling. And that brings me back to the reason I met you. You came to Woods Hole to run some workshops with the scientists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. That resulted in a science story slam. I think that was the name of it, right?
yes.
Science story
It was
slam.
more of a showcase because we didn't draw names out of a hat or anything. We just let everybody tell a story.
Yeah, and I found listening to those stories, and I feel like what's similar about the world of scientists and the world of process improvement and doing these problem solving transformations is they're steeped in data, right? And these are people who live with observations and data and experiments, just like our world. And here they were telling stories, some involved like the reality of losing the woman who lost her hearing, right? And the story of that arc. And these are 10 minutes, right? These were tight. And or the one that really got me was the woman who talked about basically being in denial about her own heart condition and just minimizing it and ignoring what her doctor was saying, and finally having to face facts that she had something she had to deal with, and that it gave her empathy for people who were espousing climate denial. And she had, so that her arc was sort of becoming empathetic to this attitude, right? And because she had it in herself. And so I feel like these are great examples of, um, and I know those are stories that their own arcs are transforming, but then but those back to the, my main focus is it moved others, right? It elicits empathy. And I feel like that is so powerful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I always say to storytellers when I'm working with them, look, people may not know what it's like to be, underwater studying a volcano, but they do know what it feels like to have your heart race or to be so nervous to think that everything's about to, that you're not going to discover the thing that you've been working for 10 years to discover. They understand those human feelings. And as long as you can kind of go through and punctuate with those things, that's how you connect to the listener. That's how you draw them in by those are the things we can relate to and empathize with. It's the emotion, it's the human experience, even though your situation and your experience may be completely different. I may
Mm.
not, an astronaut can tell a story about going to space. I won't know what that's like, but I can understand when he's saying it put the fear of God in him, to sit on top of that much of that many explosives, you know, you know,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
those little things that connect you.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm.
Let's talk a little bit about the book, How to Tell a Story. So what inspired you to write it, and what gap do you feel like you were hoping to fill for readers by having that book created?
My colleagues and I had worked together for 20 years, I mean, at that point, and we realized that we had developed a language around storytelling that we knew. We would say things like, oh, the story would be better if you could just cheat the stakes. So, you could just make it feel a little more compelling. We had all of these phrases that we would use constantly. And, we would describe when somebody had way too many details in a story, we're like, it's like having too many vases on the mantle. If you take
Uh-huh.
away a few, the pretty ones can pop and you can really
Uh-huh.
shine and see them. They can shine and you can see them, And so we realized that we should collect this language around storytelling that we had. And, obviously it's from our perspective of telling a story, telling a personal narrative. It's not the only way that a story can be told by any means, but it is the way that we approach storytelling and
Mhm.
personal narrative and so it was a lot of fun. I mean, we learned a lot. We would do group writes where we would say, okay, let's pick a subject. We'd all go away and we write about it and we come back together. And that's where we really started to see our own language around storytelling because we all use similar phrases and we all describe certain things. And then we kind of melded those things together. And it's really, I mean, it's unique that several people write a book together in that way, but it really did work. And it was a fun exercise, actually,
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
fun collaboration.
Yeah, no, you could tell. And you all had examples throughout. So you had these different voices all bringing all these elements. So when Tracy and I coach people who are trying to change the way things are done in an organization, right? They're trying to improve the way things are done. And they've got, just the natural um, resistance of people that, why are you changing this? Or I've done it this way for 20 years. You want me to do something different? Like, this is hard. And, all of the sort of structural data gathering, the experimentation, the implementation plan, all that stuff is really solid. But then there's the people, right? So they don't necessarily want to go along with things. So always we try to encourage them to bring story into what they're doing, right? Bring that, what's this doing for people, and give us, something to ground this and make it relatable, right? That it isn't just the data, but how does this become relatable? And and I'm hoping that this book could help folks get better at doing that element because I feel like that makes a huge difference. But where do you find people struggle the most? Like, where do you find people sort of what are the stumbling blocks for most folks?
I think it's difficult to be vulnerable. And everybody wants to be funny. I had a woman who had a story about losing a child, and she was like, I don't want to be a downer. This isn't fun. I want to be funny. I'm like, yeah, but this is not a funny story. You can't like this is, but that's the instinct and I think it's because that's an immediate gratification, right? You know that you're connecting to your audience, because of laughter. But I think there's something too about the vulnerability. It's easier to be fun. It's easier to get a laugh than it is to kind of share your heart in a way. And I think it's trust. I think that when I'm working with people and I meet a lot of resistance when I give a note or something, I'm like, you may want to try it this way. And they're like, oh, but I always tell it this way. And I'm like, yeah, but it may not be clear on the ear. You may want to do it. You might want to rearrange your detail, and often it's about gaining their trust, giving them some examples, giving them really listening to them and then showing them how this process can work or how the story structure could work in a different way, and let them look at it and sit with it as opposed to decide now, like, we're going to make this change right now. I might let me just do a draft of it and I'll send it to you and you tell me what you think, with that little reorder. And often they'll come back after having a minute to reflect and to see it. But oftentimes it takes a while for them to trust that I think they're the ones who have to get up on stage in my situation and tell the story. So for me to tell them, you should do it this way, and then to be like, ooh, but am I gonna look bad if I do it that way? Or will I be perceived differently if I do it that way? The stakes for them are higher. So I have to build trust with them so that they trust my advice, that I want them to do the best that they can do, and that I want them to knock it out of the park. So I'm not going to lead you astray, and we can try it. And if it doesn't work, we can amend it and fix it, but and zhuzh it until it does work. But
Yeah.
it's I do think I keep coming back to the word trust, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's also interesting, so I have not finished your book yet, but I know you can't see it right now, but I'm reading it. It's so interesting. And what I love is the explanation of the story slam. It's about 5 minutes. And you've got some rules in here. So vulnerability and then setting up the rules, I think those were super powerful to me. I'm like, oh, right. Like it must be true. It must be on theme. It must have stakes. And so I think having clarity around that. But what I like even more is the moth don'ts. Right?
Yes.
Well, oh yeah, that would be terrible. Right? Like, please don't explain a culture that is not yours. Yeah, that's probably not a good idea. Or don't make it another person's identity or their identity, their punchline. Like, oh yeah, gosh, that would be horrible. So I think the trust here is going to be really important, because what if they go down this path of a story and you're like, ah, right. So I'm sure that those were from mistakes that people made.
Well,
Or
and the story slams have been around almost, they started a year or two after we started the main stage shows, and yeah, I mean, we had a lot of people who we saw a lot of stuff happen on stage. We saw what worked. I mean, by the time we wrote the book, we had listened to thousands of stories. I mean, not exaggerating, it was. And so you could tell what works, what doesn't work, and for me, when I'm working with this, my end goal is to make sure that the audience, the listener, stays connected to that storyteller, that they don't get distracted by something or offended by something or this, you know what I mean? There are all these potholes that I navigate as a director, trying to make sure that they can make their way without hitting them. But yeah, I mean, I think that whole do's and don'ts list definitely came about from all those years of listening, seeing what worked, what didn't work, being horrified at certain moments by some of the stories that came across the stage,
uh,
But in general, I'd say people are pretty respectful, and try,
That's
they
good.
definitely.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think for me, one of the discoveries just reading the book was, oh, I think I have a lot of anecdotes. And and then I thought, oh, I don't think I'm really clear on the stakes. And just these things that I think as a human you either assume or you don't think it's worth relaying, or you think it's understood. And I feel like probably what you do is try to tease out some of those details um, that people just sort of gloss over. Um, and then on the other side, and I feel like a big message from you is always less is more. That like you said, what was it? Taking some of the vases down off the mantle. Like,
Mhm,
do you need,
mhm,
you're not going to see any of them if there's six up there. And I remember you were just back to kind of the facts and data, right? So that's our world. And I think I remember you saying it was a story and the person wanted to put in a lot of dates, and you were like,
Yes.
maybe not so many dates.
Yeah.
uh-huh,
You
uh-huh.
got to stop with all the dates. Yeah. But to people, and I work with scientists often, and that's the thing, right? They deal in data. They deal in, so in 1995 we did this, in 97 we did this, in 98. But the brain thinks, oh, I need to know that date, so I'm going to hold on to it. And then you throw another date at them, and they're like, oh, okay. And then you throw another one, and they're like, and suddenly they can't remember the dates and they panic, and you've lost them because they're so worried about, do I need to remember that piece of information? And they're not hearing what you're saying at all.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? Like sometimes those, we call them distracting details,
Mm,
things that to you, they sound really interesting and important, but to the listener, they're so distracting that you've just lost them from the bigger picture.
mm,
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we have so many questions for you, but I know we're getting short on time here. But I just want to mention that, we obviously work in process improvement, and, culture is a big part of it. And, a lot of times culture is defined by the stories that are being told, the stories that 20 years ago, and that they're still bringing up this story. And, sometimes the story is tying people to a certain behavior or characteristic or culture. And I've heard people say, if you want to change the culture, you got to change the stories that people talk about or that they share as representation of the culture. And so my question to you is, so so you went to Woods Hole and you were coaching people on a slam. And so are you doing a lot of coaching like that to help people to be better storytellers? And is in the professional world, what it's very important, but I'm sure sometimes you get this, well, why are we doing a storytelling workshop, or is that even a thing? Like, so tell me a little bit more around how you're tying, because I realize it's important. But for those people that don't really see why are we doing a storytelling workshop, or why do we got to tell better stories? Like what do you do and how do you help them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Woods Hole thing, we kind of couched it in fun, right? Like you're going to come, you're going to learn how to tell your story, you're going to pick an event or pick an experience from your life. But really, for us, it was about how to help scientists better understand what makes a good story so that when they are going out in the world to raise money or to present their ideas or their findings, that they have more of an understanding of stakes, of details, of too many dates is going to bore somebody. That they, by teaching them those kind of grounding kind of principles of storytelling, that they can apply them elsewhere. And the best way for somebody to learn is by doing, and doing a hands-on storytelling event is definitely the best way to learn. And two, they get to learn from each other. So in these workshops, I would give a note. I would say, got to stop with the dates. But somebody in the group saw it when they were telling the story with too many dates. If suddenly it became an example of what not to do in a way. And so when they corrected it and did it better, they saw how the story improved by taking that note. So they were learning from each other these
Mhm.
found, these kind of fundamental aspects of storytelling. So it wasn't just me telling them, it was each other showing each other what worked and what made a better story. And oh, if I just change this thing and add this,
Mm.
the stakes are through the roof. And suddenly I am on the edge of my seat and I've already heard you tell the story twice. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like it's
Yeah.
it's such a, I think it's it's you can really take all of those tools and then apply them later into whatever aspect it is, whether it's sales or whether it's marketing or whether it's, just interacting with your colleagues,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Connecting to a vision, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So they
Yeah.
always say, create a shared vision is the role of a leader, a huge role. And what we find is people are not very good at that. Some people are very good at it, and
Mm.
most leaders, they struggle with that.
yeah,
I think also, and you brought it up in the book too, is these are great for job interviews, right? Instead of just a list of like, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. It's like, hey, here's a story, how I figured something out or how I came to do
right. I'm a
X,
good
Y, Z.
producer because, when everything was hitting the fan, these are the things I did to save the day. It was
Yeah.
such a better example than I'm a really good producer. You know, it's,
Trust
we
me.
always say part of our language was always show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Don't tell me you're great at something, show me how. Give me an
Yeah.
example. And I think that in job interviews is exactly, it's a perfect opportunity to use that. And we taught that in the workshop.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely think the skills translate all over the place. We tell
Oh my
stories
God.
every day, all day,
Hmm.
we do
Hmm.
just every day.
Every day.
Going to the grocery
Um,
store.
I will give one final example for folks in the problem solving world. And this one is just brings a lot of examples of what you've been saying. I work a lot in healthcare, and I've seen a lot of people trying to improve one of the issues, which is patients get brought into the ER. There's a lot of scrambling, moving from room to room. They lose patients' belongings. And this is probably like the fourth time I've seen this project, and mostly people focus on the cost of replacing people's hearing aids, dentures. These are thousands and thousands of dollars that the hospital has to shell out. And this one woman uh, told the story of the patient she was working with. An elderly gentleman came in with a stroke. They lost his hearing aid. And then the reality of what that meant for him in terms of how long it took him to recover from the stroke because he couldn't communicate with the people, with her and others trying to help him rehab. And like that was so striking. There were stakes beyond this dollar. But she stayed very tight to her. It was a simple story. It wasn't like, she didn't have a lot of time. She was trying to connect. But I remember that what happened with hers, she made a much bigger change at the hospital in terms of a brand new process for taking in taking inventory, where things go. Like people were very interested in helping her shift the way people operated. And that always strikes me. I always think, oh,
Hmm.
I've got to help people get to those kinds of stories, even if they tell them really uh, in miniature, they make a difference.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'll share one as well, and that was I've seen countless keynotes and presentations at the numerous conferences that Elizabeth and I have attended over the last 25 years. And the most impactful presentation I had ever seen was a gentleman who was funny, but he told stories the whole time. And I still remember the story that he told. And he just, it was funny and hilarious, and it was about leadership. And I still remember what the story was about. And this was probably 17 years ago. And I mean, it just sticks with you. And it's just the best way, just like you said, bullets people don't remember, right?
No.
Or lists of things you can do. What people remember are the stories. And
Yeah. And
there's two.
stories are like
Yeah.
pictures, right? Like we're
Mhm.
showing people little movies so they can visualize in their mind. And it may look different in their mind, but they're still visualizing, they're still seeing it. And you remember things more clearly, I think, when you have that kind of a connection to it
Mhm.
or
Um,
engagement with it.
that's a lovely, that's a
Darn.
lovely end note. The creating a little movie. Um, So is there anything else, any parting advice for our listeners, Meg?
Or anything we didn't share that you would like to share?
Um, Parting advice. I mean, I think often I'll call somebody. A lot of people that tell stories that I work with they don't, they're not performers. They are scientists. They are business people. They are, they run all the gamuts of, the full gamut of experience and backgrounds but not all of them are well versed at being on stage. And often the first thing they'll say to me is, I'm not a storyteller. And I think that that's just not true. I think we all have stories in us. I think when you're thinking about stories, you don't have to think of the ultimate story of my life. You can think of small stories and they can be equally impactful. And our stories are important. They're the things we pass down to our kids. They're our history, they're art, and I think that yeah, I guess that's my piece of advice to people is you do have stories and your stories are valuable.
Mhm.
That's great.
Mhm.
Well, we'll leave all links for people to connect with you and find the book and other resources that you guys have been so generous with. And so great to have a little bit of Sweden at the cafe.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Thank you
sunny
so
outside,
much, Meg.
you can't
Yeah,
see outside.
this- can't see, but I see the sun. I see that Tracy's a little early on the West Coast, so we see nothing but darkness. And then, um, kind of
Yeah,
East Coast, middle America.
we're dotted across.
Done it
Thanks
across.
so
We
much
did.
for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Ah, awesome. All right,
Thank
Meg, we
you.
will talk again soon.
Hopefully, next time we'll go to Sweden and have a coffee with you there.
You're always invited.
All right, things you guys should be aware of. Tracy is doing a workshop for the Lean Construction Institute, LCI, in Arlington, Texas on October 22nd. She's doing a pre-conference workshop that is almost sold out on embracing the leader role in creating ideal conditions and coaching problem solvers. Tracy, can we get a little preview of your workshop?
Yes. So what we do really talk about is it is geared towards leaders and it is really thinking through what their impact is and ultimately what is really the three things they need to do. Really, let's just do two things because leaders, they got a lot on their plate and there's just two things they got to remember to do. And if they do these things, it helps all others. It's not just okay for process improvement. But we also talk about creating ideal conditions. How do you create ideal conditions as a leader? How do you assess ideal conditions? And then also, how do you actually build a routine? And so, a lot of this process improvement support is based on routines. A lot of things in leadership are around routines
Mm.
and having a routine so it's almost like a habit. So we really talk about what those routines could be. And ultimately, it's not cookie cutter. It's not going to work for everybody, but it could work for you. And then we also talk about how we coach problem solvers and some general tips that everybody can use to coach problem solvers better. So now I'm going to give you a little info on Elisabeth and what she's doing. So hold on to your hats because you got a chance to join Elisabeth in an online book discussion October 10th, 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. Eastern with the Michigan Lean Consortium's Lean Virtual Coffee. And this month they are focusing on Picture Yourself a Leader. Yay! And they're going to be pulling out some great micro lessons, those small shifts in habits and mindsets that can strengthen collaboration, problem solving, and innovation. So you don't want to miss that. I mean, it's a little nugget. You could join virtually from anywhere in the world. October 10th, 8:30 to 9:30 Eastern. And it's free for members of the consortium and $20 if you're not a member. So register for that and start your morning right with Elisabeth.
Oh, yeah.
Also, I'm going to be keynoting and doing a workshop on October 16th in the great state of Missouri. They have a conference called Show Me Excellence and refers to the community of OpEx practitioners across the state of Missouri that work together to improve the processes, pursue innovative solutions, and share best practices. I'm really excited to go to this conference. I haven't been to this conference before. It's the Show Me Excellence community focusing on a continuous improvement to serve the citizens of Missouri through effective government. So if you want to attend the Show Me States, Show Me Excellence conference, register soon because it's coming up. Stay tuned for all the news by joining our community at the Just in Time Cafe.
Thanks for joining me and Tracy for another fabulous episode. You are our favorite thing about the Just in Time Cafe, and we look forward to being your lifelong learning partners.
So join us next month and every month for your jolt of lean caffeine.